The ancient stone walls of Ravenshollow Castle had witnessed centuries of royal secrets, but none quite like the one Princess Isabella discovered on that fateful autumn morning. As the eldest daughter of King Edmund III, she had always prided herself on understanding the intricate web of palace politics, but what she uncovered in the Queen's private study would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Isabella had arrived early for her scheduled meeting with Queen Sophia, her stepmother who had married her father 5 years prior. The Queen was nowhere to be found, but her desk drawers had been left partially open, revealing documents that shouldn't exist. With trembling hands, Isabella pulled out a folder marked with the royal seal, expecting to find routine correspondence. Instead, she discovered something far more sinister. The documents revealed a carefully orchestrated plan spanning decades. Queen Sophia, before her marriage to the king, had been systematically gathering information about the royal family's vulnerabilities. Bank statements showed mysterious payments to foreign accounts. Correspondence revealed discussions about weakening the monarchy's influence. And, most shocking of all, there were detailed psychological profiles of each family member, noting their fears, weaknesses, and potential pressure points. Isabella's heart raced as she read through page after page of calculated manipulation. The Queen had positioned herself not as a loving stepmother and wife, but as someone with a far more ambitious agenda. There were references to the ultimate goal and Phase 3 implementation, language that suggested this was all part of a larger conspiracy against the royal family. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made Isabella quickly photograph the documents with her phone before carefully replacing everything exactly as she had found it. She slipped out through the servants' entrance, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had discovered. This wasn't just about personal betrayal. This was about the security of the entire kingdom. As she made her way to her private chambers, Isabella's thoughts turned to her younger brother, Prince Alexander. As the heir to the throne, he would be most affected by this revelation. Alexander had always been emotional and trusting, often wearing his heart on his sleeve. The knowledge that the woman he had come to see as a mother figure was potentially working against their family would devastate him completely. Isabella spent the rest of the day in her room, pacing back and forth as she tried to process everything she had learned. The Queen had been so convincing, so warm and caring toward the family. She had supported Alexander through his struggles with public speaking, had been there for Isabella during her own personal crises, and had seemingly brought happiness back to their father after years of mourning their biological mother. But now, looking back with this new knowledge, Isabella began to see patterns she had missed before. The subtle way Queen Sophia had isolated certain family members during important discussions, how she always seemed to know about private conversations she shouldn't have been privy to, and the gradual changes in palace staff that had occurred since her arrival. The weight of this secret felt crushing. Isabella knew she couldn't keep this information to herself, but she also understood the delicate nature of the situation. Making accusations against the Queen without absolute proof could tear the family apart and potentially destabilize the monarchy. Yet staying silent while Queen Sophia continued whatever plan she was executing felt equally impossible. That evening at dinner, Isabella watched her family interact with Queen Sophia, noting every gesture and word with new scrutiny. Her father looked genuinely happy as he spoke with his wife about upcoming state visits. Alexander laughed at one of the Queen's stories about her charity work. Even the palace staff seemed to genuinely respect and admire her. It was a masterful performance, Isabella realized, one that had been perfected over years of careful preparation. As the evening wore on, Isabella made her decision. She would need to gather more evidence before she could expose the truth, but she would also need allies within the family. The question was who she could trust with information this sensitive. Her father was clearly too emotionally invested in his marriage to see the truth objectively. Alexander, while trustworthy, might not be able to handle the revelation with the discretion it required. The next morning, Isabella began her careful investigation. She started by reviewing old palace security footage, looking for any unusual activities or meetings. She discreetly questioned longtime staff members about changes they had noticed since Queen Sophia's arrival. Most importantly, she began documenting everything she had seen in the Queen's study, creating a detailed record that could serve as evidence when the time came to reveal the truth. What Isabella discovered over the following days only confirmed her worst fears. The Queen's influence had been far more extensive than she had initially realized, touching every aspect of palace life and royal duties. The conspiracy she had uncovered was not just about personal gain, but about systematically weakening the monarchy from within, making it vulnerable to external pressures and potentially foreign influence. As Isabella delved deeper into her investigation, she realized that the confrontation she was planning would change everything. Once she revealed what she knew, there would be no going back. The family would be forced to face a truth that would shatter their sense of security and trust. Alexander, in particular, would struggle with the emotional impact of learning that someone he trusted had been manipulating him all along. The princess knew that when she finally chose to speak, her words would carry the weight of the crown itself, and the reaction would determine not just the fate of Queen Sophia, but the future stability of the entire royal family. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella's devastating discovery, and the evidence she had collected painted an even darker picture than she had initially imagined. Hidden in her private safe were photographs, documents, and recorded conversations that revealed the true extent of Queen Sophia's deception. The time had come to share her findings, and Isabella knew exactly who needed to hear this first. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the king's sister and Isabella's aunt, had always been the family's voice of reason. As a former intelligence officer who had served the crown for decades before retiring to royal duties, she possessed both the analytical skills and emotional strength needed to handle such explosive information. Isabella arranged to meet her aunt at the family's private retreat, away from the palace's potential surveillance. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Thornfield Manor as Isabella arrived with a briefcase containing her evidence. Lady Margaret greeted her with concern, having noticed her niece's increasingly strained demeanor over recent weeks. They settled in the library, surrounded by centuries of family history, as Isabella began to reveal the shocking truth about Queen Sophia. Lady Margaret's expression grew increasingly grave as Isabella presented document after document. The evidence showed that Queen Sophia had been recruited years before meeting the king, specifically targeted for her ability to integrate into royal circles. Her entire courtship had been orchestrated by a network with connections to foreign governments and corporate interests seeking to influence the kingdom's policies. The most damaging revelation was a series of encrypted communications showing that Queen Sophia had been providing sensitive information about the king's private discussions with world leaders, details about the kingdom's military capabilities, and insights into the royal family's personal vulnerabilities. This information was being used to manipulate international negotiations and potentially compromise national security. Lady Margaret's military background allowed her to immediately grasp the implications. This wasn't just personal betrayal, it was espionage at the highest levels of government. The Queen had access to state secrets through her marriage to the king, and she had been systematically exploiting that access for years. As they reviewed the evidence together, Lady Margaret helped Isabella understand the broader context of what they were facing. The network behind Queen Sophia appeared to be part of a larger effort to destabilize traditional monarchies across Europe. Similar patterns had emerged in other kingdoms, where trusted individuals had gained access to royal families only to later exploit their positions for foreign interests. The weight of this realization settled heavily on both women. They weren't just dealing with a personal family crisis. They were confronting a sophisticated intelligence operation that threatened the very sovereignty of their nation. The decision of when and how to expose this conspiracy would have far-reaching consequences for international relations and national security. Lady Margaret immediately began planning their next steps. They would need to involve the kingdom's intelligence services, but they would have to be extremely careful about who they trusted. If Queen Sophia's network had successfully infiltrated the royal family, there was no telling how deep their influence extended into other government institutions. The conversation turned to the impact this revelation would have on individual family members. King Edmund would be devastated to learn that his wife of 5 years had been deceiving him from the very beginning. The man had genuinely loved Queen Sophia and had believed their marriage represented a new chapter of happiness after years of mourning his first wife. But it was Prince Alexander's reaction that concerned them most. Isabella's younger brother had always been sensitive and idealistic, someone who trusted completely and loved deeply. The knowledge that Queen Sophia had been manipulating his emotions and exploiting his vulnerabilities would be crushing for him. Lady Margaret worried about how such a revelation might affect his ability to fulfill his future role as king. They spent hours discussing the timing of their disclosure. Lady Margaret suggested they needed more concrete evidence of the Queen's current activities before making any accusations. They would need to catch her in the act of transmitting information or meeting with her handlers to have an airtight case that would stand up to international scrutiny. Isabella agreed, but expressed her growing anxiety about allowing the Queen to continue her activities while they gathered additional evidence. Every day that passed meant more state secrets potentially being compromised, and more emotional manipulation of her family members. The guilt of her knowledge was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Lady Margaret proposed a carefully orchestrated plan. They would begin by discreetly monitoring Queen Sophia's activities while simultaneously briefing select members of the intelligence community who could be trusted. They would also start preparing the family for the eventual revelation, beginning with subtle questions about the Queen's behavior and gradually building toward the full disclosure. The plan required incredible discretion and patience. Isabella would need to continue acting normally around Queen Sophia while secretly documenting her activities. Lady Margaret would use her intelligence contacts to investigate the broader network and identify potential accomplices within the palace staff or government. As they concluded their meeting, both women understood they were embarking on a dangerous path. If Queen Sophia discovered their investigation before they had gathered sufficient evidence, she might accelerate whatever final phase of her plan she was working toward. Alternatively, she might disappear entirely, leaving behind a damaged royal family and potentially taking valuable intelligence with her. The drive back to the palace felt longer than usual for Isabella. She would now have to face Queen Sophia at dinner that evening, knowing everything she knew, while maintaining the pretense of normal family relationships. The acting required would be exhausting, but it was necessary to protect both the investigation and her family's safety. That evening, as Isabella watched Queen Sophia interact with her father and brother, she noticed details she had missed before. The way the Queen subtly steered conversations towards sensitive topics, how she always seemed to remember important dates and details that she shouldn't necessarily know, and the almost imperceptible way she observed everyone's reactions to her words. The revelation had transformed Isabella's perception completely. Where she had once seen genuine warmth and care, she now recognized calculated manipulation. Every smile seemed practiced. Every gesture appeared to serve a purpose beyond simple affection. It was a masterclass in long-term deception, and it had fooled them all for years. As the evening progressed, Isabella began to understand the true scope of Queen Sophia's influence on the family dynamics. She had positioned herself as the peacemaker during conflicts, the confidant for personal problems, and the supportive figure during public appearances. This central role had given her unprecedented access to information and influence over decision-making processes. The most chilling realization was how Queen Sophia had specifically targeted Alexander's insecurities and emotional needs. She had become his primary source of encouragement and guidance, effectively making herself indispensable to his psychological well-being. When the truth finally came out, the betrayal would strike at the very core of his identity and self-confidence. 2 months into their covert investigation, Isabella and Lady Margaret had uncovered evidence that exceeded their worst fears. Working with a small, trusted team from the kingdom's intelligence services, they had documented Queen Sophia's regular communications with foreign agents and identified several palace staff members who were part of her network. The time for action was rapidly approaching, but they needed one final piece of evidence to ensure their case was unassailable. Commander James Hartwell, head of palace security and one of the few officials they had brought into their confidence, had been monitoring Queen Sophia's private communications through sophisticated surveillance equipment. Late one evening, he contacted Isabella with urgent news. The Queen was planning to meet with her primary handler in just 2 days, at a location outside the palace grounds. The meeting was scheduled to take place at an exclusive private club where Queen Sophia regularly attended charity functions. Intelligence suggested this would be her final briefing before implementing what they had codenamed the Succession Protocol, a plan designed to manipulate Prince Alexander's ascension to the throne in ways that would serve foreign interests. Isabella felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. The conspiracy wasn't just about gathering intelligence. It was about positioning Queen Sophia to influence the future king's decisions through psychological manipulation and emotional dependence. Alexander's trusting nature and deep respect for his stepmother made him the perfect target for this long-term strategy. Lady Margaret assembled the core team for an emergency briefing. Commander Hartwell would oversee the surveillance operation to document Queen Sophia's meeting with her handler. Meanwhile, Isabella would need to maintain absolute normalcy to avoid arousing suspicion. The most challenging aspect would be managing Prince Alexander's emotional state once they revealed the truth. Dr. Eleanor Reeves, the royal family's trusted physician and psychologist, had been quietly brought into their circle to help prepare for Alexander's inevitable emotional crisis. She had been observing his interactions with Queen Sophia and confirmed their fears about the depth of emotional manipulation that had occurred over the years. The Queen had systematically identified Alexander's deepest insecurities: his fear of not living up to his mother's memory, his anxiety about public speaking, his worry about being worthy of the crown, and had positioned herself as the solution to all these concerns. She had become not just a stepmother, but a psychological anchor, making her betrayal all the more devastating. As the surveillance operation unfolded, Isabella found herself living in a state of constant tension. During family dinners, she had to respond normally to Queen Sophia's questions about her daily activities while knowing that every word might be analyzed for intelligence value. The Queen's seemingly innocent inquiries about Isabella's upcoming diplomatic trips and her meetings with foreign dignitaries now took on sinister implications. The morning of the surveillance operation, Isabella noticed Queen Sophia seemed unusually nervous. She made several calls on her private phone, speaking in hushed tones that she claimed were related to charity work. Her explanation felt rehearsed, and Isabella realized the Queen was likely receiving final instructions from her handlers. Commander Hartwell and his team positioned themselves strategically around the private club where the meeting would take place. Using advanced surveillance equipment, they would document not only Queen Sophia's interaction with her handler, but also attempt to identify other members of the network who might be present. While the surveillance team prepared for their operation, Isabella found herself alone with Prince Alexander in the palace gardens. Her brother was practicing a speech he was scheduled to deliver at an upcoming state dinner, and his nervousness was evident. Without thinking, Isabella found herself studying his mannerisms, looking for signs of the psychological conditioning that Queen Sophia had likely implemented. Alexander's dependence on his stepmother's approval was obvious in the way he spoke about seeking her advice for his speech. He mentioned how Queen Sophia always knew exactly what to say to calm his nerves and boost his confidence. Isabella realized that this emotional dependency was precisely what made the Queen's manipulation so effective and so dangerous. As evening approached, the surveillance operation commenced. Commander Hartwell maintained radio contact with Isabella, providing updates as Queen Sophia left the palace under the pretense of attending a charity board meeting. Her behavior during the journey suggested she was following counter-surveillance protocols, taking an indirect route, and making several stops to ensure she wasn't being followed. The meeting took place in a private dining room at the exclusive club. Queen Sophia's handler was identified as Viktor Petrov, a businessman with known connections to foreign intelligence services. Their conversation, captured through sophisticated audio equipment, revealed the final details of their long-term operation. The recording was devastating. Queen Sophia provided detailed psychological profiles of King Edmund and Prince Alexander, noting specific triggers and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She discussed upcoming state visits and shared information about the kingdom's military modernization plans. Most disturbing of all, she outlined strategies for manipulating Alexander's decision-making process once he became king. The conversation revealed that Queen Sophia's network had been planning for years to position her as the power behind the throne. They had calculated that Alexander's emotional dependency on her would allow them to influence major policy decisions, particularly those related to international trade agreements and military alliances. As Commander Hartwell's team documented the meeting, Isabella received real-time updates about the conversation's content. Each revelation felt like a physical blow, confirming their worst suspicions about the scope and sophistication of the conspiracy they were facing. The meeting concluded with Viktor Petrov providing Queen Sophia with final instructions for the next phase of their operation. They discussed timing for certain revelations that would further destabilize the royal family and create opportunities for the Queen to position herself as the essential stabilizing force in Alexander's life. When Queen Sophia returned to the palace that evening, she seemed relaxed and confident, clearly believing her meeting had gone undetected. She joined the family for a late dinner, sharing stories about the charity meeting she claimed to have attended. Her performance was flawless, demonstrating the years of training and preparation that had gone into her deception. Isabella struggled to maintain her composure as she listened to Queen Sophia's fabricated stories about helping disadvantaged children through her charity work. The contrast between the Queen's public persona as a caring philanthropist Her actual role as a foreign agent was jarring and deeply disturbing. That night, Isabella met secretly with Lady Margaret and Commander Hartwell to review the surveillance footage and audio recordings. The evidence was overwhelming and would be sufficient to expose the entire conspiracy. However, they now faced the challenge of deciding how and when to confront Queen Sophia while minimizing the trauma to the royal family. Dr. Reeves joined their late-night meeting to discuss strategies for supporting Prince Alexander through the revelation. She warned that the psychological impact could be severe and long-lasting, potentially affecting his ability to fulfill his royal duties. They would need to have comprehensive support systems in place before proceeding with any confrontation. The team agreed that they would need to move quickly once they began the exposure process. Queen Sophia's network would likely attempt to extract her if they suspected the conspiracy had been discovered. They would have only one chance to present the evidence and ensure that justice was served while protecting the royal family from further manipulation. As dawn approached, Isabella returned to her chambers with the weight of the coming confrontation heavy on her mind. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of destroying the only family stability that Alexander had known for years, but she would also be saving him from a lifetime of manipulation and protecting the kingdom from foreign influence. The choice was clear, even if the emotional cost would be devastating for everyone involved. The morning Isabella had dreaded finally arrived. Armed with irrefutable evidence of Queen Sophia's treachery, she faced the task of informing her family about the devastating betrayal that had been unfolding under their roof for years. Lady Margaret had insisted they follow a carefully planned sequence of revelations, beginning with King Edmund and ending with the most vulnerable family member, Prince Alexander. Dr. Reeves had spent the previous evening preparing sedatives and developing a crisis intervention plan for Alexander, whose emotional stability was their primary concern. The young prince had a major diplomatic reception scheduled for the following week, and they needed to ensure he would be capable of fulfilling his duties despite the psychological trauma he was about to endure. Isabella requested a private audience with her father in his study, the same room where she had spent countless hours as a child, learning about duty, honor, and the responsibilities of royal leadership. King Edmund entered the room with his characteristic warm smile, completely unaware that his daughter was about to shatter his world. The king's reaction to the evidence was even more devastating than Isabella had anticipated. As she presented document after document, recording after recording, she watched her father age before her eyes. The man who had ruled with strength and wisdom for over 2 decades seemed to crumble as he realized the depth of the deception that had defined his personal happiness for the past 5 years. King Edmund's hands trembled as he listened to the audio recording of Queen Sophia's meeting with Victor Petrov. When he heard his wife discussing his personal vulnerabilities and sharing intimate details about their private conversations, his face turned ashen. The betrayal cut deeper than political espionage. It was a violation of the most sacred trust between husband and wife. The king's initial response was denial. He questioned the authenticity of the recordings, suggested that Isabella might have misinterpreted the evidence, and insisted that there must be some explanation that would vindicate Queen Sophia. His desperation to protect his marriage was heartbreaking to witness, but Isabella had prepared for this reaction. Commander Hartwell was summoned to provide additional confirmation of the surveillance operation and the chain of evidence. His military bearing and reputation for uncompromising honesty helped convince the king that the evidence was genuine and the conspiracy was real. The moment of acceptance was visible on King Edmund's face, a mixture of rage, grief, and profound disappointment. The king's next concern was for Alexander. He immediately grasped the implications of Queen Sophia's psychological manipulation of his son and heir. Years of carefully cultivated dependence had made Alexander vulnerable to influence, and the revelation of this betrayal could destabilize his emotional foundation just as he was preparing to take on greater royal responsibilities. Lady Margaret presented their plan for handling the confrontation with Queen Sophia. They would need to coordinate with international intelligence agencies to ensure that her network couldn't extract her before justice was served. They also needed to prepare for the potential diplomatic fallout when foreign governments learned that their secrets had been compromised through the royal marriage. The king's military training took over as he began to think strategically about the crisis. He authorized the immediate implementation of security protocols that would prevent Queen Sophia from leaving the palace grounds while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. The last thing they needed was for her to realize she had been discovered before they were ready to act. As they planned the confrontation, King Edmund's grief became increasingly apparent. He spoke about the intimate moments he had shared with Queen Sophia, wondering which were genuine and which were calculated performances. The knowledge that their entire relationship had been built on deception was devastating for a man who had opened his heart after years of mourning his first wife. The afternoon brought the most challenging part of their plan, informing Prince Alexander. Isabella and Lady Margaret had decided to present the information gradually, beginning with general concerns about Queen Sophia's background before revealing the full extent of her betrayal. Dr. Reeves stood by with medical support if the psychological shock proved too severe. Alexander's reaction was immediate and visceral. The young man, who had always struggled with self-doubt, suddenly found himself questioning every positive interaction he had ever had with his stepmother. The encouragement that had built his confidence, the advice that had guided his decisions, the emotional support that had sustained him through difficult times, all of it was now tainted by the knowledge of manipulation. The prince's first response was to defend Queen Sophia, much as his father had done. Alexander insisted that Isabella must be mistaken, that the woman who had helped him overcome his public speaking anxiety and supported him through personal crises couldn't possibly be a foreign agent. His denial was accompanied by visible physical distress, trembling hands, rapid breathing, and tears of confusion and fear. When Isabella played the audio recording of Queen Sophia discussing Alexander's psychological vulnerabilities with her handler, the prince's emotional collapse was complete. He heard his stepmother describe his deepest fears and insecurities as tools to be exploited, clinical observations about his character weaknesses that could be manipulated for foreign interests. Dr. Reeves immediately intervened as Alexander began showing signs of a panic attack. His breathing became labored, his vision blurred, and he seemed unable to process the magnitude of what he was learning. The psychological trauma was exactly what they had feared, the destruction of his foundational trust in the person who had become his primary emotional support. The most heartbreaking moment came when Alexander asked Isabella if his stepmother had ever genuinely cared for him or if every interaction had been calculated deception. The question revealed the depth of his emotional investment in their relationship and the devastating impact of learning it had been artificial from the beginning. As Dr. Reeves worked to stabilize Alexander's immediate psychological distress, Isabella found herself questioning whether they had made the right decision in revealing the truth. Watching her brother's world collapse was agonizing, but she knew that allowing the manipulation to continue would have been far more damaging in the long term. Lady Margaret took charge of the practical arrangements while the family dealt with their emotional crisis. She coordinated with intelligence services to prepare for Queen Sophia's arrest, arranged for increased security around all family members, and began planning for the diplomatic challenges that would arise when the conspiracy became public knowledge. The evening brought in surreal family dinner, where Queen Sophia continued her performance of loving concern while surrounded by family members who now knew her true identity. Isabella watched in fascination and horror as the queen expertly read the room, noting the tension but attributing it to routine royal stress rather than suspecting that her cover had been blown. Queen Sophia's behavior that evening provided additional confirmation of her training and sophistication. She subtly probed for information about the family's mood, offered comfort for their apparent stress, and positioned herself as the understanding and supportive family member they could rely on. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that continued even as her world was about to collapse. Alexander struggled visibly during dinner, barely able to make eye contact with Queen Sophia while she offered him encouragement about his upcoming diplomatic reception. The contrast between her apparent concern and the recorded conversations about exploiting his vulnerabilities was stark and deeply disturbing. As the evening concluded, Isabella realized that tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. Queen Sophia would be presented with the evidence of her betrayal and given the opportunity to confess before being formally arrested. The revelation would mark the end of 5 years of deception, but also the beginning of a long healing process for a royal family that had been manipulated by someone they trusted completely. The night before the confrontation, Isabella found herself unable to sleep, thinking about the courage it would take to face Queen Sophia with the truth and the strength her family would need to recover from this devastating betrayal. The woman who had seemed to bring happiness back to their lives had actually been systematically destroying their security from within, and tomorrow they would finally put an end to her destructive influence. The confrontation took place in the throne room at dawn, a deliberate choice that emphasized the gravity of Queen Sophia's crimes against the crown. Isabella stood beside her father and brother, while Lady Margaret and Commander Hartwell flanked the entrance doors. Dr. Reeves remained nearby, ready to provide medical assistance if Alexander's emotional state deteriorated further during the proceedings. Queen Sophia entered the room expecting a routine family meeting, her usual confident demeanor intact. She wore an elegant blue dress that Isabella remembered her saying was King Edmund's favorite color, another calculated detail designed to maintain her emotional hold over him. Her surprise at seeing the formal arrangement and serious faces was carefully controlled, but Isabella caught a flicker of concern in her eyes. King Edmund took the lead, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil they all knew he was experiencing. He presented the evidence methodically, beginning with the documents Isabella had discovered and progressing through the surveillance recordings of Queen Sophia's meetings with foreign agents. Each piece of evidence was delivered with the measured tone of a monarch pronouncing judgment. Queen Sophia's initial reaction was a masterpiece of shocked innocence. She expressed bewilderment at the accusations, demanded to know how such lies could be fabricated, and appealed to the family's knowledge of her character and devotion over the past 5 years. Her performance was so convincing that Isabella found herself momentarily questioning the evidence, despite having gathered it herself. The turning point came when King Edmund played the audio recording of Queen Sophia's conversation with Victor Petrov, as her own voice filled the throne room, discussing the psychological manipulation of Prince Alexander and sharing intimate details about the king's private thoughts. Her facade finally began to crack. The carefully maintained mask of loving stepmother and devoted wife started to slip. When confronted with undeniable evidence of her betrayal, Queen Sophia's demeanor underwent a dramatic transformation. The warm, caring woman they had known for years seemed to disappear, replaced by someone cold and calculating. Her posture straightened, her expression hardened, and her voice took on a different quality, professional and detached rather than emotional and familial. Queen Sophia's confession, when it finally came, was delivered without remorse or apology. She spoke about her mission as if it were a professional assignment rather than a personal betrayal. She had been recruited specifically for her ability to infiltrate royal circles, trained for years before being positioned to meet King Edmund, and had successfully executed a long-term intelligence operation. The most chilling aspect of her confession was her clinical assessment of each family member's psychological vulnerabilities. She discussed Alexander's need for maternal approval as if it were a tactical advantage to be exploited rather than a young man's genuine emotional need. She described King Edmund's loneliness after his first wife's death as an operational opportunity rather than recognizing the human grief she had manipulated. Prince Alexander's reaction to hearing Queen Sophia speak so coldly about their relationship was devastating to witness. The young man who had struggled with confidence issues now faced the reality that the person who had helped him overcome those struggles had been manipulating him all along. His emotional support system had been artificial, designed to make him dependent and controllable. Isabella watched her brother's face as Queen Sophia explained how she had identified his fears about living up to his mother's memory and had positioned herself as the solution to his insecurities. The calculated nature of what Alexander had experienced as genuine care and support was clearly breaking his heart in real time. Queen Sophia's revelation about the succession protocol confirmed their worst fears about the long-term goals of her mission. The plan involved positioning herself as Alexander's primary advisor once he became king, using her psychological influence to guide his policy decisions in ways that would benefit foreign interests. Years of emotional manipulation had been designed to culminate in this ultimate betrayal. The scope of information that Queen Sophia had transmitted to her handlers was staggering. She had provided detailed intelligence about military capabilities, diplomatic strategies, economic policies, and personal information about world leaders who had visited the palace. The security breach was far more extensive than they had initially realized. King Edmund's questioning revealed that Queen Sophia's network had operatives in other European royal families as well. Their operation against the kingdom was part of a broader strategy to destabilize traditional monarchies and democracies across the continent. The implications for international security were enormous. As the interrogation continued, Prince Alexander began to speak for the first time since Queen Sophia's confession began. His voice was quiet but filled with a pain that was heartbreaking to hear. He asked her if any moment they had shared had been genuine, if she had ever felt any real affection for him, or if everything had been calculated manipulation. Queen Sophia's response was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. She explained that developing genuine emotions would have compromised her mission effectiveness. Every expression of care, every moment of support, every gesture of maternal love had been a professional performance designed to achieve specific objectives. There had never been any real affection, only strategic relationship building. The immediate aftermath of the confession involved Queen Sophia's formal arrest by Commander Hartwell's security team. As the handcuffs were placed on her wrists, she maintained her cold, professional demeanor, showing no signs of remorse for the emotional devastation she had caused to people who had trusted her completely. Isabella found herself studying Queen Sophia's face as she was led away, searching for any sign of the woman they had believed they knew for 5 years. There was nothing familiar in her expression, no trace of the warmth, humor, or caring that had seemed so genuine. It was as if the Queen Sophia they had loved had never existed at all. The days following the arrest were marked by intensive debriefing sessions with intelligence agencies and preparations for the diplomatic fallout from the exposure of such an extensive espionage operation. Foreign governments needed to be notified about compromised information, and security protocols throughout the palace and government had to be completely overhauled. Prince Alexander's recovery became the family's primary concern. Dr. Reeves worked with him daily to process the psychological trauma of learning that his foundational relationship had been built on deception. The young man who had once been confident in Queen Sophia's support now questioned every decision he had made under her influence. The upcoming diplomatic reception that Alexander was scheduled to host became a crucial test of his ability to function in his royal role despite the emotional devastation he had experienced. Isabella watched her brother struggle to rebuild his confidence without the artificial support system that Queen Sophia had created for him. King Edmund aged visibly in the weeks following the revelation, grieving not only the loss of his wife, but also the realization that 5 years of his life had been built on lies. The man who had believed he had found happiness again after years of mourning now faced the fact that his entire marriage had been an elaborate deception. The investigation into Queen Sophia's network led to the discovery of several other foreign agents operating within the government and military. The security breach had been far more extensive than anyone had realized, requiring a comprehensive review of personnel and procedures across all levels of the kingdom's administration. As months passed, the royal family slowly began to heal from the betrayal they had experienced. Alexander gradually developed genuine self-confidence, learning to trust his own judgment rather than relying on external validation. King Edmund focused on his duties as monarch, finding purpose in protecting his kingdom from future infiltration attempts. Isabella reflected on the courage it had taken to expose the truth and the strength her family had shown in facing such a devastating betrayal. The discovery of Queen Sophia's deception had nearly destroyed them, but it had also revealed their resilience and commitment to protecting both their family and their kingdom from those who would exploit their trust.